We come here because climate change poses a grave and growing danger. This is not fiction, it is science. Unchecked, climate change will pose unacceptable risks to our security, our economies, and our planet.
The Copenhagen Agreement must be ambitious.
We cannot fail.
Copenhagen could be a real moment when the whole world comes together.
We cannot win.
It's just not about negotiation, it's all about survival.
We're mugging the planet in a really very serious way.
This is wrong.
Weak, pathetic, crawling politicians.
I'm not really an activist, I'm a mum.
Solar, thermal, energy. We don't trust any pledges of commitment.
Pay their fair share.
If you save the small island states of the world, you save everybody.
Make it possible for the world to stay below 2 degrees.
It is often easy to forget about big issues such as climate change as we go about our daily lives. Living in the industrialised world, we are so sheltered from many of the direct consequences. And although most of us understand that climate change is the biggest threat humanity has ever faced, we don't really know what we can do to help, or even if it's possible to make a difference at all. In 2009, the world waited with bated breath as the United Nations climate change negotiations built up to the Copenhagen conference. This was a once-in-a-lifetime moment to achieve a real solution to climate change and force the industrialised countries to drastically reduce their greenhouse gases being spewed into the atmosphere. In 2013, we now know that Copenhagen dramatically failed, and that since then there have been 3 more climate change conferences in Mexico, South Africa and Qatar, plus the Rio Earth Summit, none of which produced a commitment by governments to implement solutions as radical as the science demands. If we are to avoid repeating the fiasco of Copenhagen, we need to understand why it failed. Today, many solutions are emerging, not in the media or in government processes, but in local community action. What follows is the story of 2 approaches to combating climate change. In part 1, the political struggle to get a legally binding agreement in the UN climate change negotiations. And in part 2, community action from individuals who've decided they can't wait for governments to act.
I hope so strongly that we are able to succeed in Copenhagen, but it's always much more easy to find arguments for why we are going to fail, because there are so huge problems, so many unsolved challenges. But at the same time, that was in a way the same situation we had before 1997 in Kyoto. But when we met, the world was able to agree, at least on the Kyoto Protocol. And I think and I believe that we were able to agree also in Copenhagen.
But if we fail in Copenhagen, it will be much more costly, and the human suffering from climate change, unfortunately, will be much worse than if Copenhagen is a success.
I think Copenhagen in many ways will be a defining moment of the 21st century. That's not to over-dramatize it, it's just to put it in context. We are going to decide in December 2009, 220 days from where we stand today, whether we are going to take measures to reverse the inevitable slide into a disastrous scenario of global warming by stabilizing emissions by 2015. That's in 6 years' time. We are still talking to each other as if we've got 60 years' time to do that.
We know from the science, really, really clearly, we are mugging the planet in a really very serious way. And there are three responses to a mugging. You can either turn your head the other way and walk on by. And that's probably, if we were honest, that's probably what most of us would do. We'd pretend we hadn't seen it because we didn't really want to get involved. Another way is to say, well, actually, if that mugging is going on, if we don't join in, then someone else who's doing the mugging will get a competitive advantage. And we hear this over and over again on the climate change agenda. We can't do this because we'll lose out economically. Well, that's the same thing as saying we would join in with the mugging. Or there's a third approach to muggings. Muggings are wrong. We all accept muggings are wrong, I think, and there is a moral imperative for us to stop that mugging.
In 2013, the global temperature has risen 0.8 of a degree centigrade above pre-industrial levels. And we have passed the milestone of 400 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's been at least 800,000 years since carbon dioxide was at this level, and we are already witnessing more and more extreme weather events all over the world. Climate scientists predict that an increase of only 1.5 degrees will result in the disappearance of small island states and coral reefs. And yet, most of the wealthy countries have decided that a target of 2 degrees is acceptable.
2 degrees C doesn't sound like a big increase in temperature, but that will have very large impacts around the globe. Some places will see 6 or 7 degree temperature rises from that 2 degrees C.
We have reduced agricultural lands, we have destroyed a lot of it, we have reduced biodiversity, we have overfished. We're going into this with our planet in a very bad state of repair, badly in need of repair. And what we're saying in under 2 degrees is let's flip a coin, and if heads, we win, we get 2 degrees or less. If tails and you lose, it's over 2 degrees, and it was great Earth while it lasted. We have science to guide us. We shouldn't be flipping coins, and that's what 2 degrees is.
The problem with the whole Copenhagen process is exactly the same as the problem with the Kyoto process, which is that it's a matter of horse trading. Every nation is trying to get the smallest cut for itself possible whilst loading the cuts onto other nations. And that means that the cuts can never be tailored to what the science says. They get tailored to the politics instead.
The UN climate change meetings leading up to Copenhagen show little sign of urgency. Once more, delegates gather in Germany to continue the complicated negotiations. One of the major issues being discussed is the role deforestation plays in climate change and how to address this in the agreement being negotiated. Forests are an important store of carbon and a major source of carbon emissions when cut down.
Forests are the wild card in these negotiations, and they'll either take us closer to or further away from our goal of combating catastrophic climate change.
With the release of the Stern Review on the Economics of Climate Change in 2006, he found that deforestation is responsible for 18% of annual CO2 emissions, greater than global transport sector. So overnight, forests went from kind of a side issue to, well, as people are saying now, that it's widely accepted that unless we halt deforestation, we will not win the battle against climate change.
We've seen failed banks, failed insurance companies, and failed automobile companies all get significant financing from governments. The forests have never failed us, and that's an investment that we need for our long-term future. Not just for the carbon, but for the people, for the biodiversity, for the planet. If we want to protect these forests in the long term, we need to make sure we get things right in the short term. And the short term starts in Copenhagen.
Most of the deforestation of tropical rainforests is carried out in order to meet the demand of industrialised countries. These forests are home to millions of people, plants and animals, and are the lungs of the earth. They remove carbon dioxide, the main greenhouse gas, from the atmosphere and release oxygen on which all life depends. Forests also generate rainfall, store water and control flooding, as well as stabilise the soil. Stopping deforestation is a crucial step in the fight against climate change. But for the millions of people who rely on these forests for food, medicine and shelter, simply forbidding them to cut down their trees without any form of compensation would be a violation of their rights.
Rainforest Foundation Norway is concerned with two things. We want to protect and strengthen the rights of the traditional inhabitants of rainforests around the globe. And of course, we want to protect the rainforest. And we believe that by securing the rights of the original inhabitants of the rainforest, that's the best avenue to actually protecting the rainforest, using it sustainably long term. People can get concrete benefits from having trees standing. They are used to getting benefits when they cut down the trees. So the idea that social development, some health services, some job opportunities can come out of standing forest, not just chopped down forest, is essential. It's a new idea, it is concrete, it is real, but it must be planted in people's minds. Business as usual in a country like DR Congo, for instance, which has the second largest rainforest on earth, and it is not much deforested. Business as usual for the future will mean to open up that vast area for industrial scale logging, for plantations, etc. And you will have a climate bomb really exploding in the Congo.
Of the 70 million people living in the Congo, around 40 million live in the rainforest. This is one of the poorest countries on earth. Industrial scale logging is a potential source of income, but one that would be disastrous for the planet. To ask them to forego such income without providing adequate compensation is simply wrong. It's this inequity of outcomes between developed and developing nations in the face of climate change that has led to the term climate justice. At the heart of climate justice is the fact that the industrialised nations built their wealth by polluting the atmosphere with large amounts of carbon dioxide for industry, power generation and transport, as well as cutting down many of their own forests. If the developing world follows suit, it will almost certainly result in runaway climate change. Climate justice dictates that the rich countries have a moral responsibility to provide money and technology to help the poorer nations develop in a low-carbon, climate-friendly way. This is a global justice issue, and the wealthy world has a historical debt to pay. Given the historical reluctance by the wealthy countries to provide the necessary aid, the temptation to log their forests must be great. For many Congolese forest dwellers, growing enough food is a struggle. Many communities are remote, with no electricity, no transport to markets, and even basic food like rice or sugar is often difficult to get. Schools have few resources and life is hard.
Vous voyez que les gens qui vivent ici mènent une vie très petite. Très petite pourquoi? Parce qu'il n'y a pas de cantine, il n'y a pas de moyen de transport pour aller s'approvisionner facilement ailleurs. Donc, il n'y a pas de courant, il n'y a pas d'Internet.
Given the impact on climate change, if the forests of the Democratic Republic of Congo are lost, not only will the lives of locals be at risk, but all our lives. If money is not provided for forested countries like the Congo, the logging companies will soon run rampant.
It's just an appalling contrast between the willingness to put billions on the table in a matter of seconds when the bank system collapses, and the endless sort of talks and negotiations to put small money on the table in terms of avoiding dangerous climate change. It's appalling.
Back at the negotiations, the proceedings are moving at a snail's pace and in complex legal language that even many delegates don't understand.
I know what text is on the table at the moment. I have seen it grow into something completely unmanageable. When we tried to translate it into the official UN languages, the interpreters told us we can't do it because it's not even English. So how can we translate it into, well, laugh? I mean, it's actually rather sad.
Greenpeace campaigners risk arrest and take direct action to wake up the delegates. Anna Keenan is a young Australian climate campaigner who has been closely following the negotiations since the Bali Climate Change Conference in 2007.
One of the things we've been doing in Bonn is the How Old Will You Be in 2050 campaign. I think the reason it's been so popular is that not only does it sort of connect and say, oh, young people are the moral stakeholders, they're the ones who are going to be around in 2050, you're all going to be dead. It actually says that over the next 4 decades, it's young people who are going to spend their working life implementing the outcomes of whatever the agreements are here in Poznan and in Copenhagen and so on. Copenhagen could be a real moment when the whole world comes together and focuses its efforts on a massive transition, which is what we need.
We're here to defend the country of the Maldives from the threat of sea level rise. We believe that they have the right to survival. We believe that their survival is not negotiable.
And I'm getting more worried because I've been attending 1 or 2 scientific side events, and my God, the news is bad. The ocean acidification is much worse than people think. It's the #1 problem with the oceans. And the problem with ocean acidification is not about climate or weather, it's the breakdown of the whole ocean system. The plankton and the zooplankton go and everything as we know it. And the ocean, which was our greatest sink, greater than the forests, is now absorbing less and less carbon dioxide. It's just, that's why you have the acidification. It's just saturated. The science is terrifying.
I'm a parent myself. I have 4 kids, and of course I'm worried about the future. I'm worried about when researchers tell about climate changes, food production, energy situation, pandemic situation. Of course, it's scary. It's really scary. It's so many things now to be scared about. My need is actually in one way also to protect my mind from all the scary impulses. I need to also have a hope and faith in a good life in the future for my kids. And that's why it might be hard for me to accept that the climate change is coming. Is it really so? Can it be true? Maybe I should listen to some other researchers that have another message. I think I do so. It's much better. It's much more convenient.
Even if just 1.5% of the Antarctica ice was to melt, it will give us 1 meter sea level rise globally, everywhere from Norway to New Zealand. And I mean, people may think 1 meter is not a lot. It's an enormous catastrophe for humanity if it was to happen. I think 700 million people are living below 1 meter, and in countries like Bangladesh or the Caribbean islands, it would be. It's simply we can't even imagine how important, how dangerous it is.
For example, we say you should not increase world temperature more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. There are those who tell us, be flexible. You're too extreme. You have to be flexible. You're walking along up here. A man is drowning. He reaches out his hand and says, help me. You tell him to be flexible? How do you tell a drowning man to be flexible?
As we warm up the surface oceans, we put a lot more energy into the atmosphere. So you would likely see an increase in the frequency and an increase in the severity of storms and typhoons. And these generally hit, or have been historically been hitting very vulnerable parts of the world. So they're very poor communities who can't respond to them, who can't build buildings that can resist these sorts of events.
And this is the way we see it. It's begun, in the Pacific, people have begun to relocate.
To be honest, I think people are thinking climate change, so what? 2 or 3 degrees warmer in Norway are welcomed. Many Norwegians, it's really cold here at winter time. But I really don't think that Norwegians like to think of it or really want to accept what the researchers say, what we are meeting. We have a good life and we really love having it so, and we plan to continue that way. I think that's a Norwegian mentality.
The world has discovered that deforestation and forest degradation is roughly 1/5 of the total global emissions per year. 80% is not deforestation. That's basically the burning of fossil fuels, basically by the rich countries. This means that deep cuts in emissions need to be taken by those who are responsible for creating the climate problem, namely the industrialized countries.
At the moment, every government on Earth, just about, is saying we want to limit the demand for fossil fuels. It's saying you should put in eco-friendly light bulbs, you should insulate your house, you should drive a more efficient car so that you use less fossil fuel so that you produce less carbon dioxide. Fine, that's all hunky-dory. I got no complaint with that at all. But at the same time, every government on Earth is trying to maximize the supply of fossil fuels, is trying to exploit its coal, oil and gas reserves and its unconventionals to the maximum. And those two policies are incompatible. You cannot maximize supply while minimizing demand. At the moment, global policy is to say we're going to get as much of this stuff out of the ground as quickly as we can and then cross our fingers and pray to God that nobody uses it. That's what it amounts to.
The big moral problem is that we are a huge producer of oil and gas. And we are really one of the responsible nations who really are making some of the problems that hit the third world. And I think this is a really big moral question. How can we continue to build up our own wealth at the same time that we know that people in other countries die of it? How can we continue? And the way that we contribute to the climate changes. I'm a Christian person myself, and sometimes I think, will God really forgive us for this? Can we live with this? Can we die with this knowledge? I'm not sure.
Every day we have the light on, every day we drive to work, the carbon dioxide emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions we put out into the atmosphere, they stay there for 100 or maybe even more years. The concentration of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide being the most important one in the atmosphere, is increasing day in, day out. And what is most important, particularly for those of us in the wealthy nations who are emitting a lot of carbon dioxide, is to get those emissions down in the very short term. So we have to make dramatic behavioural changes now. And the time frame for that literally is the next few years. So by 2020, we need to have a 40% or more reductions in our greenhouse gases. The Americans are saying that by 2017, we will have no indigenous reduction. So no reduction will be required from within the United States boundaries by 2017. By 2020, they would have 4% reduction. Remember I was saying we need at least a 40% reduction. The Japanese have said they'll have an 8% reduction by 2020. The New Zealanders no longer have a target for 2020. The Russians don't have a target for 2020. Talking about 4 or 8% is simply inappropriate and irresponsible in my view.
The climate train rolls on, heading towards Copenhagen, and delegates gather once more, this time in Barcelona.
Canada climate sins. Ladies and gentlemen.
Anna Keenan and other activists feel compelled to take drastic action to highlight the need for climate justice to play a core role in the negotiations.
My name is Anna Keenan, and this is Sarah Spencer. And today we've begun a hunger strike for climate justice. We haven't eaten today, and we will be continuing our hunger strike, drinking water only indefinitely. The Prime Minister of Ethiopia described it best when he said that this great injustice of climate change is that those who have contributed nothing to its genesis will suffer the most from its consequences.
This year, I've seen people die in my country without food because of the failed rains. It's really, really bad back home, and certainly we need climate justice.
Thank you very much. This action is very strongly undertaken in solidarity with those people in developing nations who have contributed the least to the problem, and that's exactly what climate justice is about. That's what Climate Justice Fast is for. I don't know what else to do as a human being except to take this very personal form of action, to put my body on the line, to put my health on the line. The whole reason that I'm doing it is so that people wake up on climate change and they start to see it as the incredibly serious issue that is. They don't just sort of, that people start to emotionally engage with the issue.
After what must feel like a lifetime to the long-suffering delegates, the preparation sessions are over, and the meeting to end all meetings, the Copenhagen Conference, finally begins. The world's collective breath, held all year with a heightened sense of anticipation, is explosively released worldwide. Millions of people call for world leaders to reach a legally binding agreement that will provide a real solution to climate change.
Australia's coal, burning up the planet. Stop selling coal, Australia. It's embarrassing.
The number has been set. Radio climate change.
Delegates from 192 different countries have converged on home Copenhagen in a bid to settle this deal on global warming.
Poorer countries come to terms with climate change.
This is the time. We must deliver not a deal, but an ambitious deal in Copenhagen.
I believe that this conference will write history, but we need to make sure that it writes the right history. Thank you.
This has generally been described as probably the most complex negotiation in history. And part of that is because, the issue is complex, the science is complex, and getting countries to agree to change is complex. But on top of all that, you have this extra layer of things, which is the idea of consensus.
The whole process has to work by consensus. And if any one country, any one partner, whatever their stake in the topic, has a point of disagreement, it has to be left as an option, as a bracket, unless people can agree to hone down those alternatives. So every now and then, there might be a point that can potentially be resolved. 4 or 5 people may huddle in a corner and come to some compromise, and then propose to delete a set of brackets or have some new text. And the process often goes backwards. Sometimes you can emerge from an all-night session with a document 4 times longer than the document you started with. But eventually, with the skill of the chairs, and some other deals in corridors, often the text then gets honed down.
When you try and get 180 countries around the world to agree anything, it's bound to be slow. But the scary thing is, this is like sitting on a train that's heading to a cliff. But everyone inside the train is just moving in slow motion, worrying about the size of the track, whether the nuts and bolts are right shapes, and what the colors look like in the painting on the walls. And that train is still running flat out to the cliff. I don't know if we're going to make it.
With a minimum of ceremony, countries make opening statements to establish their positions before the negotiations move into smaller groups behind closed doors.
We clearly observe the lack of will by developed countries to commit to serious emission reductions, and as small island states, this is particularly concerning.
The European Union believes that immediate action to reduce tropical deforestation is crucial to keep global warming below 2 degrees and should form part of the Copenhagen Agreement.
Did I tell you guys about the joke about that globe over there? Some of us small islands are not on it, so it's supposed to be post-Copenhagen globe.
Keep the islands on the map! Keep the islands on the map! Keep the islands on the map!
The small island states, time is a luxury we don't have. We cannot wait. And the reason we are insisting on a legally binding agreement is because we're sorry we don't trust any pledges or commitments anymore. No one is going to get 100% what they want here. It's all about compromise. But we don't think that the developed world has compromised enough, and we think they can do more. You know, these people have already calculated it is much cheaper to put us on a boat and relocate us than to save our countries.
We are here in Copenhagen to fight for our identity, for our culture, and for our very right to exist. 50 years from now, my children will be raising their own families. It is my hope that they will still be able to call our beautiful islands home. It is my hope that their lifetimes will never be affected by devastating climate change. Excuse me. And it is my hope that our culture and our identity will never be compromised.
Well, we're looking for a very much a global agreement that puts the world on the path to a 2-degree goal. The proposal for a 1.5 degree target, as opposed to a 2 degree target, that's challenging. We hear the concerns of Pacific Islands without a doubt. Ultimately, we needed an agreement, that's both realistic and achieves the outcomes we need. At this stage, 2 degrees will be enormously challenging, but we need to get something that's fair to everybody at the same time.
We are living on the front lines of climate change. As you know, the planet is now 0.8 degrees warmer from its pre-industrial days. And at that level of heat, a large number of our islands are already experiencing significant damage. Some are going under the sea. Some are losing their fresh water supply. Others are losing their infrastructure on their coastal areas because of unusual weather patterns, particularly hurricanes. 2 degrees is completely untenable for us, and this is why, in part, we were led to take the 1.5 as the threshold for safety and survival of our islands. Well below 1.5, well below.
It is very important for you to understand why we are here in these negotiations. We are negotiating our lives. Some of us at this moment are facing the immigration of their population. It's not only population going to another country. Their culture disappearing, biodiversity for the planet disappearing. And I am talking like this because I have children. And my children will not live the same life I lived. So it is essential and crucial for us, this negotiation, to have success.
I think we have our first meeting at 7 in the morning, and last meeting gets out on a good day at 11. So usually it's more like midnight 1, get up at 6, rinse and repeat. Yeah, it's rough, and this is just the first week, so.
Environmental non-government organisations, or NGOs, are the watchdogs of the UN process, trying to ensure that the negotiations don't simply favour the rich and powerful. Kept out of the meeting rooms, they roam the corridors to stay in touch with the latest developments.
We had a couple of days that were open to the public, but now things are getting sort of more and more secretive. We're having meetings, go into closed-door sessions. Those rooms are becoming smaller and smaller, and the number of people allowed into those rooms are becoming smaller. So it's very difficult to get good information and find out what's happening. You need to have great sources, which is why we've been following this process for the last 2 years.
I have undertaken this voluntary fast in solidarity with those people who are involuntarily suffering every day because of climate change.
I'm fasting as an atonement. I feel I'm atoning for the American dream, which is the world's nightmare.
The thing that will solve climate change is the end of fossil fuels, the end of deforestation, and the end of overconsumption as a value in our society. We can't just continue to consume like there's no tomorrow, because if we continue to consume like there's no tomorrow, there will be no tomorrow for our whole generation, and that's a very scary thought.
During the 42-day fast, do you eat anything at all?
It's just been water and then a few teaspoons of salt every few days, which keeps your nervous system functioning. Without it, your brain will die.
So how many kilos or pounds have you lost?
I've lost about 25% of my body weight, or a little bit over that. So I'm wearing literally 7 layers of clothing right now. So it's about 15 kilograms.
Are you going to have sufficient mental capacity in 2 weeks to make a decision on whether you should continue or not?
We're not sure, because none of us have ever done a fast of this duration before. So, we're unable to answer that question.
No more delay! No more delay! Climate justice now! Climate justice now!
Oh yes, this is definitely not a level playing field, anything but. And this is something many developing countries have raised for the last decade or two, but it doesn't seem to be changing. For example, at the Poznan Climate COP last year, the US delegation, and the US isn't even a party to Kyoto, comprised more than 80 people, and Congo had 2. And I think the Kiribati, a small island state where climate change is a survival issue now, had 3 or 4 people. It's incredibly difficult for them just to follow the many different negotiating groups that are meeting here simultaneously. It's also very difficult to get together the kind of expertise you actually need in this kind of meeting. You need experts on forestry, you need experts on climate change reporting, you need legal experts, and I think that makes it very, very difficult for developing countries to have a say in the process.
If there was one thing that you think the rich countries could do to turn this whole thing around, what would it be?
For Tuvalu?
Yeah.
Please give us the one nice island to migrate to our people, more high.
It's all about survival. It's just not about negotiation. It's all about survival. And we are here to fight for our survival.
If there was one thing that you would ask the rich countries to do right now to turn this whole thing around, what would it be?
Pay their fair share.
What would that look like?
It would be a lot of money, but you know what? They can afford it. I think that if the rich countries don't put a substantial commitment of technology and finance on the table, we are not going to get a deal.
And on that bombshell, thank you very much.
When agreement can't be reached in a document, the text is put in brackets. Once time runs out, the text, including brackets, will be presented to the ministers and heads of state to try and make the big decisions on issues the negotiators couldn't resolve.
We're just waiting for tomorrow to have this new text that is being worked out right now, and then to see how it fits with the other text in the other areas of the negotiations, to see if it makes sense. And if that is so the case, we may be able to take some decisions depending on decisions taken elsewhere. But it seems like it is not the case, because elsewhere it is also full of brackets. So you will find brackets everywhere, and it's going to be really tough for ministers now to decide. Really, really, really bad.
What we've seen, I guess, over the first week is instead of a race to the top, a bit of a race to the bottom. It wasn't that long ago that around 15% of the Earth's surface was covered with these forests, and now we're down to less than 5%. And are we going to focus on protecting that? Or are we going to focus on doing something else? And you know, the pressure for the next week is to take the bad text that we have now, that's gotten worse from where we started, and getting it back focused on the priority, which is protecting tropical forests. Yeah, I mean, people are really frustrated. And I know that there are some parties who are fighting for the good stuff still, but it's, you know, we're that close to something good. It doesn't take that, you know, this is what I tell the US all the time. I'm like, you know, you're that close to being champions, and instead you're making, you know, you're making yourselves out to be the villains. It doesn't take much, you know. It's a few words here and a few words there, and we'll all be happy.
This is day 42, so we've got one more day. As of 4 o'clock, so I think in about an hour, we hit 1,000 hours of fasting. Those people in countries like, you know, Namibia and Kenya and Tanzania who literally do starve to death, like, you know, the hell that they must go through. You know, if I'm still alive and kicking and full of energy and vibrancy after 42 days, like, you know, granted I couldn't do physical work if I wanted to now, but, you know, if I'm still functioning after 42 days, then for people to actually die of hunger must be a totally different experience, you know, and this experience has awakened me to that reality and, you know, the hell that must be to go through. You know, I'm not really tempted to keep going. I'm enthusiastic to conclude and to be really happy with what we've done, but I am definitely looking forward to gradually easing myself into food again. Yeah.
Running out of time, delegates make one last attempt to reach an agreement on how to include deforestation in the draft agreement. The discussions go on into the early hours of the morning.
Yesterday, 2 documents were issued. The chairs have succeeded in condensing hundreds of pages of proposals into just a few sheets of paper, and those sheets of paper have been accepted as a basis for negotiation.
9 days into the negotiations, world leaders begin arriving as the world waits and hopes. Instead of immediately sitting down and negotiating solutions to the final sticking points in the draft agreement, world leaders begin a long procession of speeches to an almost empty room, aimed solely at domestic audiences back home. These go on for 2 precious days.
Facing the greatest global challenge of our time.
That is why history is calling us at this great conference to frame a grand bargain on climate change.
Have we come to Copenhagen to preside over the greatest political failure and environmental catastrophe in history? Or have we come here with a genuine determination to save the planet?
For while the reality of climate change is not in doubt, I have to be honest, as the world watches us today, I think our ability to take collective action is in doubt right now. And it hangs in the balance.
The last official day of the conference. Most of the NGOs have been removed from the building, and tension is higher than ever.
today is sort of the crunch day, I guess, in a lot of the processes. The big picture stuff is being looked at today, and it's looking less and less likely that there will be an overall agreement at Copenhagen, and for good reason, because the developed countries have not yet committed the funds that they need to commit for developing countries to adapt to climate change, to mitigate against climate change. The developed countries have not yet committed to targets in terms of emissions cuts that are going to make a difference to climate change. And unless these big picture and expensive issues are dealt with, the overall agreement won't succeed.
We all seem to be stuck. Our thoughts are stuck, our feelings are stuck, the negotiations are stuck. The emissions targets on the table still point to an increase in global temperatures of above 3 degrees, maybe even 4. It's not just bad for small island states, it's bad for everyone without exception. They all know that. Yesterday, someone from the developed world told me, even if we want a legally binding agreement, there is no time now to sort out all the details of a legally binding agreement. And I said, if you wanted a legally binding agreement, you've been stalling since, I don't know, Bonn, Bangkok. You would have unblocked it there to make sure we reach a legally binding agreement. But maybe the negotiators deliberately stalled all this time, knowing time was running out, and then they say, well, we do want a legally binding agreement, but we don't have time. Of course. You have stalled it to the position where it makes it unachievable.
When it becomes clear there is no political will to conclude a legally binding agreement, the Danish Prime Minister postpones the plenary meeting at which the world leaders were supposed to finalise the agreement negotiated over the past 2 years. Instead, he convenes a small group of leaders to come up with something, anything.
I think it's extremely disappointing that we are not getting a legally binding agreement or agreements of some kind here. I think we will end up with some kind of political accord, and there have been references in the media and elsewhere to something that would be politically binding. That's an expression that's complete nonsense. It tries to echo the legally binding concept that a lot of countries have been emphasizing. It's either legally binding or it's not, and politically binding is not legally binding. I think that we will end up with something that's meant to make the politicians look good.
While the group of 25 leaders are meeting in private, everyone else is desperate for news on what is unfolding. As negotiations drag on, the press conference to announce a deal is continually postponed throughout the day.
As soon as the meeting is over, there will be a press conference here, so bear with me.
The increasingly frenzied media are camped outside the leaders' meeting room upstairs and ambushing any delegate found in the corridors. After negotiations that go on all day and into the night, a statement called the Copenhagen Accord is finally released by the small group. But it is far weaker than anybody ever expected, with no mention of a future meeting to finalise a legally binding agreement.
It is a huge blow to the health and the future of the planet, and it's a huge blow to the confidence of the world population in world leaders. I mean, they're not racing to the challenge at all. So, I mean, we as people have to continue working, doing what we can, but the global deal is really not becoming an instrument at all, because it's a vague and defined deal. I don't think anybody had expected it to be so fruitless and resultless kind of negotiations. Amazing. Amazing.
The conference has collapsed with a sense of shock and disbelief. Many leaders from countries excluded from the process are furious.
I'm going home for Christmas and New Year, and I'm going to see what I failed to save. I'll be on a beach and I'll be thinking of Copenhagen and looking at that beach. You failed us on the one thing that really, really meant the world to us. So how can we trust you with anything else? I'm bitter.
Beautiful wars. They came here with beautiful wars. No time to wait. 120. Big man failed. There's thousands of delegates spend money now for years. This stupid result. Science are providing the reasons. Politicians need to act. So they did it. Bunch of bastards.
After parties are given 1 hour to read the supposedly new agreement, the plenary meeting is finally open.
Good morning. I apologize most sincerely for the very long wait. I have mobilized support for an accord which have been developed in a representative group with leaders from all regional groups around the world.
We are given 60 minutes to decide whether we agree or not with the decision that this small group of countries has already adopted, because they have decided that they can represent the entire world.
I feel a sense of loss because my country, being only 2 meters above sea level, is one of the biggest losers in this exercise. I feel a sense of sadness because I will have nothing to show my grandchildren for my absence for the last 2 weeks. And more than that, I have failed to secure a future for them and for their children.
This document threatens the lives and the livelihoods of millions of people in developing countries and the existence of the African continent. A solution that is based on a 2 degrees Celsius is murderous. It condemns and tunnels Africa into a fairness in order to maintain the economic dominance of few countries. And it is a solution based on values, the same very values, in our opinion, that tunneled 6 million people in Europe into fairnesses.
To compare this initiative to the Holocaust is profoundly offensive to my delegation. This is wrong. These remarks should be withdrawn.
It is shameful of ourselves, condemning each other. The whole world is watching us.
Chair, I move an adjournment. I move an adjournment of our proceedings.
The meeting is adjourned so that the delegates can negotiate a compromise. Lawyers huddle in groups until they finally come up with a solution. It will simply be noted that the accord has been developed, and it will not be voted on. It could not be further from the legally binding agreement that the world had expected. A bitter blow for those on the front line.
It is so decided.
Shame on you! Shame on you!
More than 15 million people have called for a fair, ambitious, binding treaty here in Copenhagen, and tonight President Obama went on television and announced what he called a deal, and it was unfair, and it was unambitious, and it was non-binding, and it was no deal. People are mad. People have been organizing for years. Governments have been promising this. Everyone agrees we need a real strong climate deal if we're going to stop this catastrophe. And if we don't, there are millions of lives on the line. And what was announced tonight is so far from what we need. It's just unacceptable.
Survival, we fight, oh, survival.
The failure at Copenhagen was a watershed. It was a huge defeat for those who want action on climate change because it gave succour to all of those who are opposed to action. It said, look, the world can't agree, it's all hopeless, it's all too difficult, countries are just retreating to protect their own interests, and really this represents a defeat for the science, because if the science were that serious, then the world would have come together and done something about it. And so just at this time, when the science was saying we must reach an agreement, a far-reaching agreement, to bring about cuts in emissions from rich countries of 25 to 40% in the next 10 years, a radical industrial transmission, the whole thing fell over, and we've got nothing. We have no agreement, and it's unlikely in the foreseeable future that we will have an agreement that will bring about any significant emission reductions in rich countries, let alone poor countries. So it really was a massive defeat for those who understand the science and the threat that we face.
Some of the work that we've actually been doing recently here, trying to look at the wealthier parts of the world and comparing their emissions with the poorer parts of the world, this would tend to suggest that the reductions that we're going to need in the wealthy parts of the world are much greater than we've previously accepted. So this is why I would come to the conclusion that 40% is the absolute minimum we should be looking at for 2020. And we will need virtually completely decarbonised, in other words, completely avoiding any carbon emissions by about 2030. Not after 2030, by 2030.
When you listen to the politicians, environmental matters is a very tiny, small part of the message. We are more interested in taxes, school, education, crime, immigration, healthcare systems. That's the problems that we are facing right now. Climate changes, that's 50 or 100 years ahead. Let's handle it when we come there. I think that's the general opinion. But a politician is also a salesman. He has a message he has to sell. And if it's not able to sell his message, he will not be elected. So there is a limit how far a politician can go in his message. They adapt to the market, so to say. And the market in Western Europe and in Norway, especially these days, is not for environmental politics.
We know exactly what needs to be done. I mean, there's no technological barrier in the way. There's no economic barrier in the way. We can afford to do what needs to be done. All that stands in the way is a lack of political will. And that's where hope lies. It's where despair lies as well. It's so frustrating just seeing the solutions just out of reach. They're right there, just to be grabbed, but you can't do it because of the lobbying power of these industries and these weak, pathetic, crawling politicians who allow themselves to be bullied into inaction by these industrial lobbyists and by the world's billionaires. Despair ensures that there can be no solution. You have to pursue what you believe to be right and pursue it as vigorously as you can.
After the fiasco of Copenhagen and continuing lack of commitment for real action by governments since then, it is clear that waiting for a government-led solution to climate change could take years. And it's not just deforestation that must be reduced. The forests and oceans cannot absorb enough carbon dioxide to stop the temperature increasing. We must reduce our carbon emissions, specifically the burning of fossil fuels. Around the world, there is a growing belief that if we want carbon emissions to go down, we will have to do something ourselves. Like a rising tide, community pressure is mounting on governments to replace the burning of fossil fuels with renewable energy. One example of a community taking a stand for clean energy is Port Augusta in South Australia. Mayor Joy Balouche, Australia's longest-serving female mayor, now 80 years old, has been in conflict with the coal-fired power stations on the edge of her town for decades.
The choice that's facing Port Augusta is the same choice that's facing Australia, and that is to repower Port Augusta and to repower this nation with solar thermal energy. I am not going to retire from this fight against all governments until they see that we should cease the burning of fossil fuel, that they must go to renewable energy.
Come on, Sam. How you going, Ben? Come on.
I'm not really an activist. I'm a mum who wants a good environment, and I want my great-grandchildren to live. As a practice nurse, I see a lot of the older and the younger coming in, and I notice that a lot of them have lung problems. They're either got lung cancer or the kids are getting asthma earlier, those sorts of chesty things a lot.
Climate justice is not only an issue for developing countries. The pollution from burning coal is also a climate justice issue.
Respiratory problems and lung cancer and all other forms of cancer have become the norm in Port Augusta. The politicians will argue the reasons for that, but we have positive proof that this power station is emitting carcinogenic emissions which cause these cancers.
Well, Port Augusta has these two coal-fired power stations with brown coal, and that's the most polluting form of coal. So when it's burnt in the power stations, it's not only producing carbon dioxide, that's greenhouse gas, which floats around the world and puts the temperature up. It's producing local pollution as it burns. But the most damaging pollution is the stuff you can't see, unfortunately. It's the tiny particles. And they're not only inhaled, they're absorbed into your body. So in effect, they can cause damage in your heart and blood vessels and brain and so on. It's not just that you get bronchitis or asthma. And Port Augustans have been breathing particulates for the past 20 or 30 years. They've suffered injustice in that nothing has been done. That's basically how I see it.
My husband had lung cancer. He did work at the power station. Then he left because of ill health. He was a non-smoker, and then he developed this lung cancer. But he passed over 16 years ago. He was the father of my children. He was my friend. He was the love of my life.
Alinta strenuously refute any links that interest groups may make between the emissions of the power station and health aspects to the community. In fact, Alinta have complied with all EPA regulations, and the EPA about 12 months ago stopped monitoring on site because a lack of issue, if you like, or no concern. Recent studies have not differentiated between dust created from the environment and emissions from the power station. So there's no evidence at all, no creditable evidence to suggest that there is any issue, so we strongly refute that.
I have been fighting my battle since 2000. I had a mastectomy, and then it reoccurred in 2007 in the bowel. And from there it went to the liver, then my ovaries. So I still have to continue this fight for my life. And together with it, the fight for my city. Because I still believe that we have a great place to play in the history of this nation, and I know we can. In Port Augusta, we have 360 days of sunshine, and solar, thermal, plus wind power seems to be the answer here.
An array of 6 solar thermal plants would be needed to replace the coal-fired power stations in Port Augusta, at a cost of around $6 billion. A vast field of mirrors, individually tracking the sun, reflect immense heat onto a central tower that contains molten salt. The salt is heated and stored in tanks at the base of the tower. On cloudy days or at night, the heat in the stored salt is used to create steam to drive the turbines and generate electricity. In Adelaide, an alliance of environmental groups is set up to support Joy's campaign to have the coal-fired power stations in Port Augusta replaced with solar thermal power and wind energy.
Ultimately, for the state, what we want is a clean energy future. The attractive thing about large-scale solar thermal at Port Augusta is that we've already got the poles and wires at Port Augusta as a hub for South Australia. And we could put this in and it would complement the wind energy that we have.
A bit of a no-brainer, really. It's just about getting the government on side to actually do it. It's a problem.
Yeah, the government, the community and the company. Dan's going to be up in Port Augusta organising the committee vote. How soon are you getting up there?
I'll be shifting there on Monday to work with the local group, which is really exciting.
In some countries, particularly the United States and Canada and Australia, there is a profound reluctance on the part of the general public to insist that their governments take far-reaching actions. Whilst most people accept that climate change is happening and vaguely want something to be done, they're not marching in the streets, they're not closing down the CBDs, they're not surrounding the parliaments and refusing to allow the politicians to leave until they've passed far-reaching legislation, even though this is the greatest threat they have ever faced, the most profound threat to the futures of our children and grandchildren.
Locals in Port Augusta meet to organise a community vote on whether to replace the coal-fired power stations with solar thermal or gas.
I see it would be good to be able to get somebody to go and speak to each of those groups.
And our actual role here is just to get the community support.
We've tossed around a few ideas of how we can get people to actually vote.
We know exactly where we're going, though. That's the best thing.
We're trying to push this to sort of say, hey, there's jobs in this. There's jobs, there's, well, everything that we need for Port Augusta, really, in this solar thermal, and we should have the people of Port Augusta behind us big time.
When trees began dying on the land she used to own, Kay decided she had to do something.
I haven't been back here for 18 months, and to look around and see the trees that were healthy 5 years ago, and to see them now, I'm truly devastated. I feel passionate about it because I believe that the forests and the trees, well, they're the lungs of the earth. So if we kill off the lungs of the earth, we won't have oxygen that we need. So these trees dying has really been, well, my catalyst to think, well, perhaps there's something I can do to see that lots more trees like this don't die. I've never managed to be passionate about anything like I believe this to be. I believe that if we don't do this, God only knows what's going to happen, because I don't think anybody does.
The community group kicks into action. Posters are put up around the town, and experts brought in to help with the campaign are put to work.
Beyond Zero Emissions is a research and education group that look at renewable energy in Australia, and we're bringing to the public's attention the opportunity for replacing the Port Augusta power stations with renewable energy, and solar thermal in particular. Replacing these power plants with renewable energy, particularly solar thermal, is a once-in-a-generation opportunity, because if they get replaced by gas, then we're going to be stuck with gas for another generation, for another 50 years. So it'd just be tragic if we miss that opportunity.
Gas is an important transitional energy source.
obviously of a lower carbon footprint than coal, and provides us with an opportunity to reduce our carbon footprint, at least in the short term, as we find more sustainable ways of sustaining the energy needs of our state.
The cost of building 6 solar thermal power towers to replace Northern and Playford would be, and the wind turbines as well, would be about $6 billion in capital cost. A gas plant is much cheaper. It's a fraction of that. It would probably be about $1.5 billion. The problem is that you then have to pay $15 billion at least in gas bills over the life of those plants. So gas plants are really cheap to build, but you pay for it for the next 50 years. It's a bit like if you buy a cheap printer. You don't have to spend much on the printer, but you pay for you pay many times that for cartridges over the life of the printer.
And I heard you on the radio talking about the move to try and close the coal-fired power stations here and go with concentrated solar thermal. So I thought I really must get myself to Port Augusta. There's some really interesting things happening here. So that's why I came. I think it's fantastic that you've shown the leadership that you have. It's very clear that we need to go from fossil fuels straight to renewables. It's just no use going to gas, because what you're just going to do is go from one fossil fuel to another fossil fuel.
Exactly.
And all the debate about gas being that much cleaner, given the recent work on fugitive emissions and also the coal seam gas and so on, potentially it's as bad as coal and only marginally better in some cases.
The group begins distributing the voting boxes around town as the community vote is launched.
This issue is the most important issue I believe that this community has faced in all of our history. It is you to decide whether we have solar or gas. And I'm urging you, with every breath in my body, to vote for solar thermal.
Good afternoon, ladies.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Now, have you voted in our community vote?
Yes, we have. Yeah, we don't want gas.
No. Basically, it's about the future of the power stations, the coal stations, whether when they close down, whether we want to see them replaced with solar thermal, which this is a model of that, and that's a photo of it operating up in Spain, or gas.
Hi, how are you? Hello, Senator Bill. Lovely to see you again.
Yes, that's right. Welcome to my home.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you very much. The last time I saw you was in the Federal Parliament.
That's right.
That's
Lovely to see you. Fracking is banned in plenty of countries in Europe. Why is it an option?
Well, it's starting a new industry in Australia at the end of the fossil fuel age. That's what I find so frustrating with the whole coal seam gas industry. Right at the end, it's the sort of last kick of the dinosaur, and they decide to make a new industry out of it. And not only is it bad in terms of global warming and greenhouse gases, and they've never actually measured the fugitive emissions that we're getting from coal seam gas on the ground here, but you're actually jeopardising your long-term agricultural productivity at a time when we need to maximise food production. Yeah. So you have to ask yourself, who's really running the country? And it comes down to a lot of the coal and gas barons who are having such an influence on the major parties.
I think what we're seeing in countries like the United States and Australia, and indeed Britain, is a corruption of the democratic process, particularly over the last 30 years, with the convergence of the main political parties on free market economics. And with the disappearance of ideology, it's now just about money politics. And so the democratic process has been profoundly corroded. And the truth is that we won't make substantial progress in reducing emissions until democracy can be recaptured. At the moment, any serious measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is immediately undermined by these powerful interests. So really we're witnessing not just an environmental crisis, but a crisis of democracy.
the bagger. Tip the bagger. There. Bag mail. There. There.
Now there.
I would just like to thank everybody who's been involved in this very crucial vote to our community. I would particularly like to thank Dan and all of those who have come from outside of our city. So thank you to everybody. You too. Thank you. And good luck to all of our venture. Cheers. Cheers.
So we're here today to finalise the community vote, wrap it up and I guess give the results. And we've had over 4,000 votes collected in the last week or so, and 4,053 of those Port Augustans have voted for solar and only 43 have voted for gas. So I think this is a really clear message that the Port Augusta people have sent to politicians, that they need to be investing in the future of Port Augusta, the future of South Australia and the future of all Australians by investing in renewable technology like solar thermal, replacing coal with renewables. It's what we need to do in the 21st century. So congratulations to everyone involved, and hopefully we'll see solar thermal built here before too long.
A lot of people just didn't know what to do, and they were relying on us or relying on somebody else, and then somebody else eventually had to be somebody, and that was us.
We've got voices and we will be heard.
After the success of the community vote, the Australian Youth Climate Coalition decides to make a bold statement. They begin a 300-kilometre march over 2 weeks from Port Augusta to Adelaide. The plan is to deliver the Port Augusta community vote to the state government.
Climate change isn't happening in 10 years, it's happening right now, so I'm definitely worried. And that's why I want to take action on it. It's not something that you can sit around and just ignore. Every single person together, united, is where the change happens.
The planet's warming and I'm still young. How can I not act?
I'm so blessed to be here because there are so many like-minded people here that have this urge inside them to actually do something. I've been sitting in my house for 1.5 years moping about climate change and the implications it will have on society. Here's a group of people that have so much energy and they just want to get something done, and I'm getting caught up in all this. It's really, really exciting.
I don't think government and industry are going to be able to do anywhere near enough to effectively tackle climate change unless at least 50% of the population is demanding it, basically.
People feel that they can't do anything about climate change, but I personally think that that's not correct.
The group that's organising this, Repower Port Augusta, is a perfect example of this. A group of people have come together and they have planted their flag. This is what we're doing. It has attracted an enormous range of people from all over Australia to come to support their cause. And I think one day we will see a solar thermal plant in Port Augusta.
It has been so empowering to see like-minded young individuals who are actually doing something about it. And of course we can all complain and wait for the politicians to solve this issue for us, but it's not going to happen, so we need to do it ourselves. We're rallying our politicians, we're mobilising people, and we're making a difference. We are making a noticeable difference.
If you want solar thermal, clap your hands. If you want solar thermal, clap your hands.
Thousands gather to welcome the footsore but elated marchers.
In the same way that big tobacco was able to throw doubt and confusion about whether tobacco really was dangerous for you, big energy did the same thing about global warming.
The crowd joins them on the last leg of the march to Parliament House.
future is being sold for short-term profits, and that is something that I take very personally. It is something that we should all take very personally. We looked at Google Maps and we said, it only takes 14 days to walk from Port Augusta to Adelaide. How hard can it be? Let me tell you, it was bloody hard. But we felt that we needed to do something hard. We needed to do something big and bold and visionary in the hope that our politicians would see that and do the same. Because this is about rights. It's about Port Augusta's right to clean air and jobs and a future for their kids, and it's about our rights to have a safe climate for our future and for it not to be sold for profit.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you for bringing this campaign to the steps of the legislators of Parliament House. I'm quite sure they are going to have to listen to us. If there is one thing that I believe in, it is people power. And what I see here today is people power. Every person in Australia should be knocking on their politician's door and saying, enough is enough. This is the way we need to go. One, for the benefit of our nation, but also for the benefit of the planet.
I think at the end of the day, people will respect politicians that think about the long-term interests of the community rather than the short-term trying to save their backsides.
The dilemma is that most governments are unwilling to get ahead of public opinion and show leadership on this issue. And the public seem to think that if things were really that serious, governments would act. It's a chicken and egg situation.
I was talking to someone on the train, and he had to sign a pledge written by his daughter after a school class to say that he would reduce his emissions by 10% that year. And he said he had to write this pledge down, and then she was going to see how he did it over the year. And he said that he felt he had to do it. He had no option. He'd written this pledge, and his daughter had pinned it on her wall in her bedroom and kept pointing this out to him. Now that is quite interesting, that, you know, that maybe the pledges don't need to be ones that we make to the government or to our friends or colleagues, but actually they're the ones that we make to our children. They're the ones that are going to inherit, you know, our profligate, selfish behaviour that we're, you know, currently committing.
In response, community groups like AYCC are emerging all over the world, demanding action from their governments to safeguard their future. These groups know we need a wartime-like effort, one where everyone feels empowered and mobilised to be part of the solution. In Boulder, Colorado, one such group is Earth Guardians, led by a 13-year-old boy, Xutescot Martinez.
A lot of people think they can't do anything, they're not special enough, that they don't have money, so they can't take action on climate change, but that's not true. That is not true. Because of the mess that the past generations have made, we have been pushed into action, and we will not stop until we are ensured a healthy, safe, habitable planet.
It's definitely really easy to start in your own lifestyles. Like, no matter where you are on the globe, you can always do something to reduce your carbon footprint, to reduce the amount of waste you produce, because it's really easy to start within your own lifestyles, and then telling your parents about it, telling your families about it, telling your friends, then educating your schools and educating your community and taking it into action and doing tree plants and marches and rallies. And then you take it from that, where you go within your home, and then you take it locally, and then you take it nationally, and you talk to governors, and you write letters to politicians about changing laws, and you take it globally, and you connect with youth from all around the world, because there's so many people around the planet that have these brilliant ideas, but we have to find a way where we can connect all those ideas so we can change the fundamental beliefs of our entire society.
I would like to go down in history as having been the one that was instrumental in having the Northern Power Station converted from fossil fuel power to clean, green energy. That's what I would like to go down in history as. The person who brought clean, green air to the centre of the universe, which is my city.
Political, top-down solutions are unlikely to happen without massive public pressure. Only when climate change is a key election issue will politicians take it seriously. In the meantime, if we want carbon emissions to go down, it's up to us to take the lead. And we can't afford to wait.